Hey friends, welcome back to the YouTube channel. If you're new here, my name is Oleg, and this is one and only Mr. Bond. We like watches. In today's video, we're going to compare a $6,000 watch to a $1,000 watch. A Grand Seiko Snowflake to a baby Grand Seiko. To a Seiko SARX 055, also known as the baby Snowflake. Now, of course, the more expensive watch is going to be better. No question about it. But how much better is it really? Is it 6 times better? Should you spend the extra money on that watch? I'm going to try to answer those questions today. Now, this video is from my point of view. It's going to be very subjective. If you own one of these watches, don't get mad at me. I'm very biased towards one of them because I spent my own money on one of them. The baby Snowflake is the one that I own, so I'm likely to favor that watch because I spent my own money on that watch. The other watch I borrowed from exquisitetimepieces.com. Check out this website, they have a great selection. Now, let's get started with the comparison. Let's talk about case dimensions on each watch. Let's begin with Grand Seiko. It has a diameter of 41 millimeters. It's 48 millimeters from one leg to another. However, including this first protruding link, it's about 52 millimeters from this point to this point. It has a lug opening of 20 millimeters and it's 12.8 millimeters thick. As opposed to the baby Snowflake, this watch has a diameter of 41 millimeters, so the same diameter. It's slightly shorter from one leg to another. This point to this point is 46 millimeters as opposed to 48 on the Snowflake, or 50 millimeters from one protruding link to the other, as opposed to 52 millimeters on the Snowflake, 20 millimeter lug opening, and believe it or not, the baby Snowflake is actually thinner by about almost 1.5 millimeters. So this one is 11.4 millimeters as opposed to Snowflake 12.8 millimeters. The weight of both watches is almost identical. They both have titanium cases, Grand Seiko weighing 98 grams and the Seiko weighing 100 grams. It's imperceptible weight difference. For another perspective on the difference between the two watches, here are both watches on watch cushions. As you can see, Grand Seiko appears to be smaller even though it has exactly the same diameter. It has more of a bezel and the lugs are a little thicker and longer, thus giving the perception of a narrower case, as opposed to the baby Snowflake, the SARX. It's almost all dial, so it kind of looks a little bit more fat, if you will. It has shorter lug-to-lug distance, so it doesn't look as proportionately pleasing to the eye as the Snowflake. In my opinion, the Snowflake, just from the case design perspective and from a smaller dial perspective, looks a little bit more proportionate and better balanced as opposed to the SARX. Here's a perspective of a side profile. Clearly the Snowflake on the right is thicker than the SARX on the left, and the difference is actually pretty substantial. So comfort on the wrist, both watches are super comfortable. Let's begin with the Snowflake. It looks great on the wrist. I love the proportions of this watch. It is admittedly a little bit too thick. It will still slide under the cuff of your shirt, but it doesn't look as refined, as neat as you would want it to be. In my opinion, actually, baby Snowflake fits better on the wrist. It just looks a little bit more elegant. It's slimmer, it will slide under the cuff of your shirt easier, and believe it or not, even though the watch looks larger, it will actually fit smaller wrists better because it has shorter lug-to-lug distance. Both watches will fit well on a wide range of different wrist sizes, but in my opinion, the baby Snowflake will fit better on smaller wrists as opposed to the Grand Seiko Snowflake. Both watches have titanium cases. The finishes on both watches are exceptional. Let's begin with the baby Snowflake. As you can see, Zaratsu polish or Zaratsu-like polish on the sides of the case, brushing on the top of the case, and also high polish on the bezel. Execution of polishing is fantastic, especially if you consider the price point of this watch, $1,000 US. It's just exceptional. And also keep in mind that this is a titanium case, which is notoriously difficult to finish in high polish especially. Seiko just did a fantastic job with the finish on this watch. Taking a look at the Grand Seiko, again, the finish is exceptional. It's one of the best finished watches in the industry. Zaratsu high polish on the sides of the case, satin finish on the top of the lugs, and again high polish on the bezel. The two cases are actually very similar in terms of the finish and their shape. Again, the Baby Snowflake Sarks is just a little bit more squished. It's almost as if you took the Snowflake case and squished it down, so it's a little bit slimmer and a little bit wider, even though they both have the same diameter, just appears that way. But overall, the case shape itself is very similar. Both watches have these polished accents on the inside of the lugs. It's more so prominent on the Baby Snowflake as opposed to the regular Snowflake. Nevertheless, both watches have that. And between the two watches, of course, Grand Seiko has a better polish, a better finish, but the difference is not as big as you would assume, given the price difference between the two watches. After you reach a certain point of quality of finish, the improvements to the finish are very hard to see. If I didn't have the two watches side by side, it would be much harder to see the differences. Nevertheless, the differences are still present. Your money is spent on a better finish, but the difference in the quality of finish is not 5 times better. It's just slightly better. As you can see, Seiko Sarks, the Baby Snowflake, has a push-pull style crown, and there is a small gap on this crown. It doesn't sit completely flush to the case. I think it's done this way so you can easily pull the crown out. As opposed to the Snowflake, the crown is sitting inside of the case because it has a screw-down crown. Both watches actually have the same water resistance, 100 meters. Just the Grand Seiko has a screw-down crown versus Seiko has a push-pull style crown. Bracelets on both watches are very similar. Both are titanium. Satin finish on top and on the sides, and both of them have these highlighted polished accents, giving some nice visual interest to the bracelet. Surprisingly, my personal preference is for the bracelet on the left, the Seiko bracelet, as opposed to Grand Seiko bracelet. I like these angles here. I like how they play with the light. And overall, the appearance of the bracelet on the left is slightly more matted, slightly more muted, as opposed to the one on the right. I think the finish quality is better, but my preference for the color and for the finish is the bracelet on the left. Again, very, very similar bracelets. It would be very difficult for me to tell the difference if I didn't have both of them side by side. The clasps are also very similar. Seiko signed clasp here, Grand Seiko signed clasp here. Both have 2 pushers for the release, and both of them have weird gaps. Grand Seiko has a gap like this, and Seiko has a gap like this. When you open them up, engineered clasp on the Seiko and engineered clasp on the Grand Seiko. No micro adjustments on either one of the watches, and pin and collar system for adjustment of both links. A lot of people complain about that, including myself. I recently learned that Patek Philippe Nautilus uses collar and pin system, so I guess we can excuse Seiko for using it on a titanium watch. The difference in the dial between the two watches is quite substantial. As you can see, Grand Seiko has an appearance of a much softer dial. It should remind you of paper, it should remind you of freshly fallen snow. As opposed to Seiko Sarks, it almost looks like frost. It's more silver dial than white, and overall it doesn't look as high quality, it doesn't look as labor intensive as the dial on the right. The overall finishes on both watches are great, however Grand Seiko just puts it on another level. The whole dial has this 3-dimensional feel to it. The applied indices play with the light really well. The blued seconds hand, the way the set of hands are finished, the cutout for a power reserve, the railway track for minutes or seconds, all of that is done to the next level. It just looks so good. All of it looks like it's just floating on top of this snowy soft dial. As opposed to Seiko Sarks, for the price it's executed really well, but the finish on these little applied indices is not nearly to the level of Grand Seiko. I also don't really like the sports style chapter ring I prefer the chapter ring on the Grand Seiko. It just looks a little bit better, more dressy. Also, the date window on the Seiko Sarks is smaller as opposed to Grand Seiko. Now seeing the two watches side by side, the date window on the Seiko just appears too small. I also like the blue accent of spring drive written there on the dial as opposed to Presage automatic written on the Seiko. I wish they did that writing in blue. It would look much better. Both watches actually have blued seconds hands, and again, Seiko has fantastic finish for a watch in this price category, but it's not nearly as nice as Grand Seiko. The difference, again, not 5 times better, but it is significantly better. Another huge difference between the two watches, the movement inside of them. Seiko having 6R15 caliber movement. It's an automatic movement with 23 joules beating at 21,600 vibrations per hour. It has 50 hours of power reserve, and the stated tolerances are -15 plus 25 seconds per day. Not too bad, but not the best movement. In the review of this watch, I stated that the movement of this watch is its weakest part. I still stand by that statement. I wish they would improve the movement, at least put a high beat movement in here, maybe regulate the movement a little bit better, make it more accurate. As it is right now, it's an okay movement. It is still in-house made, but for $1,000 you're expecting something a little bit better. As opposed to Grand Seiko, it of course has a spring drive movement. This is the next level of technology, combining accuracy of a quartz movement with the mechanics of an automatic movement. It is still charged by a rotor, but now it uses some electromagnetic forces for time tracking, and it has constant release of power, which makes the seconds hand glide around the dial. It doesn't tick, it glides, and it looks spectacular. The movement has 30 joules, 72 hours of power reserve, and stated tolerances of plus or minus 1 second per day. This movement is crazy accurate, and clearly it deserves a higher price point. I'm not sure if it deserves 5 times higher price point, but it does deserve a higher price point. So overall, between the two watches, which one do I prefer? I prefer the design and the look of Grand Seiko. I like the three-dimensional feel of the dial. However, I prefer the fit on the wrist of the Seiko Sarks. While I still had the Grand Seiko Snowflake in my possession, I had my family and friends come over at various points of time, and I actually showed them that watch. And I asked them to compare the two watches, the baby Snowflake versus the real Snowflake, and try to answer which watch looks more expensive. And most of the time, I would say like 80% of the time, people actually chose the baby Snowflake, the cheaper watch, to be more expensive than the real Snowflake. They said it just looks thinner and looks more expensive. For whatever reason, they chose that watch. I don't see it. Maybe it's because I know about these watches, so that's why the Grand Seiko looks more expensive to me, but most people answered that Seiko actually looks more expensive. I don't know what that means. I just thought it was an interesting thing, so I brought it up. Either way, if you own the baby Snowflake or if you own the Snowflake, both of these watches are fantastic. And each one of the watches has some pluses and some minuses. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I certainly appreciate you watching it until the end. Please give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. We release new videos every week. And leave a comment in the comment section below. Let me know which one do you prefer out of the two. Do you prefer the Seiko or do you prefer the Grand Seiko? I always enjoy reading your comments. By the way, today on my wrist, I'm wearing my Phoebus Voyager. I did a full review of this watch. That video can be found on the YouTube channel. I will also leave it linked in the description below. Also, in the description below, there are a couple of other links. The first link is a secret link. Have a look if you're curious. The second link is a link to bondnailstraps.com if you're looking for a great quality nail strap and want to support this YouTube channel. At the same time, going to bondnailstraps.com and buying one of those nail straps is a great way to do both. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had fun. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.
The treats.
Oh, yes, 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 yes. Nom, 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 nom. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. You're acting like you didn't eat for a whole 2 days. But in fact, I just gave you a snack banana like an hour ago. Remember the snack you got? Yeah, you already forgot about it.